in a way that you might end up stoking the coals and everything else. So what are the things that will prevent you from stoking the coals? Number one, if the food is already so cooked that there's no more stoking to be done. You know, there's the food's as good as it's going to get, and in fact, extended cooking is just going to make it worse. Okay, that's one case. Second case is if the food is so undercooked, so uncooked, so raw that cooking is not going to help it, and it's only going to be ready by the next day anyway. Number three is that you've covered the ashes. Now they covered the flames with ashes. Now the Mishna Brura makes the point over here, and this is very important. The point is not that by covering the flames with ashes that you've then basically put out the fire. That's what I would have thought. I would have thought, what's the whole thing of covering with ashes? Is that now the fire's out, but that you're reducing the heat. That's not the point. The point is not reducing the heat. It could be as hot as before. That's not the issue. The issue is once you've covered it with ash, then now it's recognizable and visible that you do not intend to be stoking these coals. So that's what's called a heker. Once you've made a heker, that's good enough. That's all we're looking for. We're looking for is for you to make a heker.
But you can still blow the
Yes, you can still ignite it and all of that. However, it all comes, there's a principle we have many times when it comes to these laws of Shabbat. What the case that we're worried about is that you're going to kind of be a bit panicked and not think it through properly and end up breaking Shabbat almost by mistake. Whereas once you've done something there to remind you, that reminder is going to serve as the safety net, as the braking mechanism. And even though you start getting panicked, you think, hold on a second, it's Shabbos, I can't actually do that. So that's the idea. So therefore, when it comes to us, we have such different stoves. Now, this whole next two chapters, I do find very, very difficult because we're speaking about such different technology. You know, we're speaking about such different utensils. So we're going to try to carry it across as much as we can. What makes it extra difficult is when the question comes up, okay, so how does this relate to what we've got? So you always find different opinions. You know, and that's also what makes it tricky. So we can understand, you know, some 16th century technology. When it comes to 20th and 21st century technology, it's not always completely clear how to carry it across, but we're going to do our best over this next hour or so. But again, the main point over here is that it's not that we actually want to reduce the heat. It's just that we want to make some kind of sign or remembrance so that we don't end up coming to stoke the coals. And therefore, our little things with the tin foil or the iron plate or that kind of thing does the trick. Now, which is the main thing over there? So I saw that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, quote here, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, the main thing is the tin foil on the knobs. The main thing is to cover the knobs of the stove, because that's really the control of the fire. That's the danger zone. That's where you're going to break Shabbat. You're not going to break Shabbat on the plate. The electric plate or the gas plate, whatever it is, that's going to carry on regardless. You touching it is not going to make a thing. It's the controls that's what's going to affect whether with Shabbat or not. So he says that's the main thing. However, he says as a chumrah, as a stringency, you should also cover the stove top itself. They've got a whole discussion here. What if you cover part of the stove top and not, not the whole thing or whatever? But that we won't go into now. So where we start in 253, chapter 2, is the laws of chazara, of returning. Now there's again two issues when it comes to returning. So now I set this cooking on the stove Erev Shabbos. Now that it's Shabbos, I want to take it off and I want to put it back. So there are two issues. Issue number one is cooking. Maybe when I put it back on, I'm actually going to end up cooking. Issue number two is looks like cooking. Even if it's not cooking, perhaps it looks like cooking. So let's speak about each of those quickly. When we're talking about cooking, if it is dry, so we have a principle that ein bishul achar bishul. It is impossible to cook something that's already been cooked. Okay, what this doesn't cover is using different methodologies of cooking, as we've had some discussion about it. You know, baking something that's already been cooked, cooking something that's already been baked. You know, that's a bit of a different thing. We're talking about cooking in the same way. So I've got my stew, right? I've had my stew on the stove. Now, is it relevant to talk about cooking that stew again? Basically, no. However, that's when it comes to dry things. When it comes to liquids, we are concerned that you can recook something. Because what does it mean to cook water? That you boil it. It's all about temperature. Once water's cooled down again, then it's now raw, right? Even though once you've made toast, it's toast forever, and letting it cool down does not make it back into bread. When it comes to water, it does do that, and we're concerned... Sorry?
Sadly.
Yes. And we're concerned with the same concern for all liquids. That once the liquid cools down, it's no longer cooked, and therefore by putting it back on the stove, you're going to make it cooking again. Now the question is, to what extent must it cool down for it to be considered raw? Must it cool down below Yad Soledet Bo, below the hot temperature, or must it have cooled down all the way to room temperature? In other words, do we say, well, once it's no longer hot, it's now raw, or do we say once it's lost all of its heat, it's now raw?
Two opinions.
Correct, Theo. The Sfaradim say that once it is below hot, it's now raw again. So this is a much stricter opinion, because this means as soon as it's dropped below Yad Soledet Bo, you're no longer able to put it back, because that is real cooking. That could be a Torah prohibition. The Ashkenazim say, look, it's not so hot, but you can't say it's raw because it still retains heat from the original cooking. So that's a much more lenient opinion. The Sfaradim also have to follow the stricter opinion as to what Yad Soledet Bo is. There's a whole range of Yad Soledet Bo. I think it's between 40 and 70 degrees. So normally we say you can't heat something up to 40 degrees on Shabbat because maybe that's cooking. But here we're worried about 70 degrees. You can't let it drop below 70 degrees and then put it back because we're worried that could be cooking. So you'll see the Shulchan Aruch mentions that it still has to be rotachat. It still has to be hot. And the Ramah later on is going to say, no, as long as it still retains some of its heat. Okay. Now, the next thing is, the next issue is nireh kamavashal. It looks like cooking. Now, the issue of looking like cooking is, even when there's no Torah prohibition of cooking in this situation, what I'm doing can appear like cooking. So, I've got a macaroni cheese, which is dry and completely cooked. And I want to put that on the stove on Shabbat. Is there any Torah problem? No Torah problem. It's already been completely cooked. I'm just heating it, not cooking it. The only problem is that Eli comes over to my house for Shabbos lunch, and he sees me putting it on the oven, and he says, we see that you are allowed to cook macaroni cheese on Shabbat. And so he comes home, and from now on, every Shabbat he cooks macaroni cheese, but he does it from raw. He didn't realize I was reheating it. It looks like cooking. So therefore, the rabbi said there's a prohibition of doing something that looks like cooking. If you want to put something on the stove on Shabbat, you have to do it in a way so that it doesn't look like cooking. Now, if you're doing it from cold, you put it on top of something else. We're going to come back to that. But if you're doing it when it's hot, then you've got to return it, not put it on. So there, you could even put it on the stove directly, but we're not talking about putting it on the stove for the first time on Shabbat. We're talking about taking it off the stove and returning it to the stove on Shabbat, because then it doesn't look like cooking anymore. Now, the Shulchan Aruch lists a number of things that make it preferable, that you should do in order to meet this. What are the conditions that they lay out? You've still got it in your hand.
Intention.
You intended from the beginning to put it back. And you never put it on the ground.
But you can't, like I say, you can't put it on the ground.
Well, we're going to come see that, but this is what he prefers. That you when you meet all those three conditions, then you're definitely returning, not putting it. So let's talk about soup on a Friday night. I've got somebody who's still coming late, but they say start without me. So I say fine. I take the soup off the stove to dish up. I dish up 6 bowls of soup. Still another bowl of soup, left inside. I want to put it back. So in the meantime, what I do is I don't put it on the ground. I keep holding it in my hand, and when I take it off, I have intention to put it back again. However, if everyone's here, I take off the soup, I dish up for everyone, I go, I put it down over there, and then somebody else comes in, they're like, oh, can I have soup? I'm like, sure, no problem, let me just go heat it back up for you. That's going to be an issue, because I never had it in mind, I let go of it, and so forth.
What's the difference? Doesn't it still look like you cooking it if someone walks in and they see you putting it on the stove?
Yeah.
They don't know that you've kept on holding it.
Okay, so the idea is we're not so worried about somebody's going to come in the middle and only see a little bit of it. We're more worried that you're at me for dinner and you're watching and seeing what I'm doing, and you will not come to the conclusion that you can put things on the stove on Shabbos. You'll only come to the conclusion you can return things to the stove on Shabbos. So you're right. If we only ever saw part of it, but there's lots of things where if you only saw part of the story, you can come with the wrong. We're worried if you see the whole thing, you'll still come with the wrong idea. Because what's the difference when I, dish it up and leave it, and I've really put the soup away, and then someone new comes in and I put it out? What's the difference between that and taking it out the fridge? People won't realize. Well, the fact that it's hot, but people don't necessarily realize. So that's why we want it to be absolutely clear that you are returning it. However, the Ramor does say, he says that, let me just see exactly. However, some do say that you don't have to do all of this, that you don't have to worry about it. You can actually return it, even if you didn't have it in mind and all of that. At the end of the day, you are returning it. And even if you only saw this, even if you're there for the whole thing, you'll still realize it's not taking it from the fridge, because it was on the stove. Sure, I didn't think I was going to return it, but now that I'm returning it and it's still hot, that's actually what I'm doing. So that's what the Ramor says, that we are lenient. We are lenient in this matter when it comes to our ovens, which are like stoves, he says, because we rely on the lenient opinion. However, it's good to go strict. Just see if the Mishna Brura says anything that we need to know. So these three requirements, which is the proper and correct way to do it, is not the be-all and end-all. In other words, if somebody comes in late and you want to put it back, you shouldn't. But if you did, it's not the end of the world. That's really the answer on that. However, if it cools down, then obviously it's going to be a problem.
And you can't serve from the stove.
Now, serving from the stove is another problem, because serving from the stove, we're worried about stirring it. And when you stir it, it could be that there were pockets of it that weren't cooked so properly. And now that you're stirring it on the stove, you actually are cooking it in that way,
So can you
yes.
pick it up, have intention to return it, keep on holding it and stir it off the stove, and put it back on?
That we're going to have to come back to with the section on cooking, devoted to cooking. So this is still, the way the Shulchan Aruch puts out the laws of Shabbat, is he does it in the order of the day. So that's why we started with all the things Erev Shabbat, and now we're still kind of Erev Shabbat, setting up for Shabbat, then we're going to go into Friday night and all of that, and then we're going to see about serving the soup. So it's a good question, but let's hold that for a few chapters. Okay, now the next halakha is halakha number 3. He says you wake up in the morning and you see that your food is starting to burn, and you're worried that it's going to get really burnt. In other words, in a perfect world, you would look at this now and you'd turn down the heat. But obviously you can't turn down the heat, so you want to know what to do. If you just leave it like this, it's going to burn. If you take it off completely, it's going to get cold. So what do? So what you do is you take it off, put an empty pot underneath, and you put this on top of the empty pot. And in the meantime, don't put your pot of food on the ground, don't let it get cool, right? It's the same kind of thing. But you're putting it, so in other words, you're putting it that little distance away from it. And the Ramor adds in as well that, look, we're not so strict about this, and if you did end up putting it on the ground or whatever, as long as it hasn't cooled down, that's still going to be fine. Then he says what some people do is they take hot water and they put it into the food on Shabbat when it starts drying out. So they put this. They've got a hot water. Now it's a similar thing to what I'll give you another example. You see that your cholent is starting to dry out. So what you do is you want to take the water from your urn and put that in your cholent. Now in principle, taking the water from your urn and putting it in your cholent is not a problem. It's cooked water, cooked cholent. You're just transferring it from one place it's cooking to another place of cooking. So what's the problem that he has over here? So the Mishna Brura says, if you were doing it 100%, then that wouldn't, like we've described, then it wouldn't be an issue. But the problem is that sometimes your water's cooled down, right? Or your food's cooled down, and either your food's cooled down and your water's still hot, or your water's cooled down and your food's still hot, and you actually end up cooking one of them. So this idea of having that, the water and the food on like different systems, the one's going to cater for the other, help for the other, that he says is not a good idea. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to do that because you're going to end up coming in trouble. Now we certainly understand that as a Sephardi problem, because as soon as the water's cooled down below like 70 degrees, this is now going to be an issue. Would the Ashkenazim also be so concerned? So the Mishna Brura says, look, for us, it's not such an issue. So even if one of them is not so hot, as long as it still retains some of the heat, that's going to be fine. And he says that's actually what we do. So this problem that the Shulchan Aruch says, and that you're not allowed to do it, is really a Sephardi problem. Nonetheless, he says there still could be other kinds of problems, and so he brings from the Magen Avraham, who wants to say, don't pour it directly from the urn into the cholent. Rather use a spoon in between, or so you give some things like that, because then you've got a klisheni, and so it's pouring from a klisheni. But in principle, it wouldn't be such a problem, because it's the concern that you're going to end up cooking with a heat differential, which is really a Sephardi concern. The next halacha, number 5. He says, now what you've got, and this is the other case of it looks like cooking. There's two cases of our concern being it looks like cooking, which we mentioned. The one is when you are taking it off and putting it back, and the other one is when you are putting something that's fully cooked on the stove on Shabbat day. Again, my cold macaroni cheese, I want to put that on the stove. So the case that the Shulchan Aruch gives is that I take fully cooked food and I put it on top of a dish cooking on the stove in order to heat it up. Now, why is that not a problem? Because this doesn't look like cooking. You can see that there's something different and unusual going on. But if I would want to wrap it up in clothing and put it on top like that, or wrap it up in cloth and put it up, that's going to be more problematic, and we're going to deal with that when we see the whole section on insulation. Then he continues. That's the same thing. Even if you've cleared out the coals and whatever else, but it's still a hot stove, you're still not allowed to put it in. When it comes to the oven, this is a discussion. Some say if the oven's actually cleared out and it's just retaining residual heat, then you can do it in the oven. Then you can put it in the oven. And some say no, you got to be strict. And everyone agrees that if it's still hot, like Yad Soledet Bor, that is problematic to put in the oven. So stoves, it's much easier to get away with because you're just putting it on top of something, and the oven you're actually putting it inside. So that's there's different opinions, and if it's really hot, then that's more problematic. And the other thing is that anything in this section that you're not allowed to do, you're not allowed to ask somebody who isn't Jewish to do. So therefore, you can't say to someone who isn't Jewish, please put the macaroni cheese on the stove. Right? Again, you've got to have something in between. But again, if it still hasn't cooled down, so then of course that would be fine to heat it up again. So therefore, he says what we often do is the way they would have it is they would have their foods packed inside the oven or whatever else, and it wasn't always so easy to get it out without disturbing coals. And to disturb coals, you're not allowed to do. So what they'll do is they'll ask the non-Jew to take it out, and deal with the coals and that whole issue, so that it wouldn't be. No problem.
He was a bit of a bad day. I misjudged things.
No, all good.
So I'm going to lay it
Thank
out,
you.
and then you boys will sit. And then
Great.
to
Lekker. So that's what he. So that's the. So in that kind of way you can do it but again we don't say these cases where you're worried that it's going to end up looking like cooking. We still have that problem even if you're asking a non-Jew to be involved. But if we don't have that issue, then it isn't. My keys are just by my seat over there. Yeah, and then for the third time in this section, the Ramor says, I've already clarified that our custom is that we are willing to return the cooked food onto the stove on Shabbat, even if you've left it on the ground and that kind of thing. Okay, that's chapter 253. Let's go on to chapter 254, which is food that was prepared Erev Shabbat that we want to now finish the cooking on Shabbat. Now we mentioned, even though when we're talking about raw meat, you can leave raw meat to cook over Shabbat, and we're not worried that you're going to come to stoke the coals because it takes so long to cook, we're just leaving it till tomorrow. We've also mentioned that Rabbi Hinken said we can't rely on that today because our stuff cooks much better. And similar to what he said, we see over here, beg your pardon, that the Shulchan Aruch says this is speaking about putting it in the pot, cooking meat, basically boiling the meat, cooking the meat in the pot on the stove. But if we're talking about braising the meat, putting the meat by a fire, so when you leave it on the stove, so then it's only going to be ready tomorrow. You just put it in Erev Shabbat, it's still going to take a long time. But when you're talking about braising it, that goes much quicker. How long does it take to braise meat from raw to edible?
What meat they fry?
Regular piece of meat, I don't know.
Steak is quick.
It was how long? An hour?
An hour for steak.
Oh, quicker, 30 minutes.
Depends how you eat the steak.
Give me an example. Edible. Rare.
Really?
The 1 minute takes 1
15 minutes.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
1 minute takes 1 minute. And
Thank
the
you.
minute 1 minute.
Thank you. Amazing. So, so that certainly then speaks to this, is that since you could get it ready so quickly, then he says, so that's the problem, that you actually really then do have this concern. So you can't get it. We've got this thing of saying, well, there's raw meat, so it's not going to be ready till tomorrow. That doesn't apply when you're talking about a braai. So you want to set up your braai Erev Shabbos, and the food's not ready when Shabbos comes in, but it's going to get ready, over the course. No, you're not allowed to do that because we're worried that you're going to come and, start interfering with the process. I mean, let me ask you, Theo, how easy would it be for an average person, right, that to see that the food's not cooking properly on the braai and just say, it's fine, I'm just going to leave it. Right? Yeah.
Can I just ask, am I allowed to touch the fire? Are you allowed to touch the meat?
Are you allowed to touch the meat?
You know when you fry, of course, yeah?
Yes. No, definitely not.
But never mentions you're not allowed to play with the food.
Yes, it's true. I mean, that's...
But it's easy on the stove.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's going to be related to like the... Yeah. But quite right. Of course, he says, if there's enough time that it gets cooked in order that you can eat it, so then that's going to be okay. But we're talking about where it's in this exact wrong zone. By the time Shabbos comes in, it's not ready. But it could be ready if you intervened. So that's the concern. So therefore, braaiing meat is setting up the braai. Erev Shabbat is no good. However, he says, here we're talking about beef or, what do you call goat meat? It's goat meat, right? Beef or goat meat. But if you're talking about like lamb or chicken or something like that, he says you are allowed to leave that because we're not worried you're going to start playing with the fire. Because if you start playing with the fire, you're going to end up burning it. Because what you don't want it to be flame grilled. You don't want it to, you just want it to be heated up. You want the fire to be there to make it hot. So therefore, he says that would be okay. Now, if it's in an oven and you've closed up the oven, So they give the example, tachpiv betit, you like almost plaster the front of the oven. So then in all of these cases it's going to be fine, because then it's basically the same thing that you've set up this kind of sign. Also he says, if you've blocked it off like this is the main reason he gives, if you've like plastered up this oven so that the heat doesn't escape. If you now want to come an hour before the meal and open up and see how it's going to do and whatever else, you've actually destroyed it. If you close it again, it's just not going to cook properly anymore. So in this kind of situation, you know, you're in for the meal. You've done everything you can do. Any kind of intervention now is just going to mess it up. So there you would leave it like that. And the Ramor says, if you're talking in that situation where you've like closed up the oven and no intervention is going to help, so then it doesn't make a difference if it's completely raw or if it's a little bit cooked. Or anything like that. Some say, then the Ramor adds in, some say that when you've got this closed oven, like we've mentioned, the seal oven, then everything's fine. But over the braai, actually everything's problematic. Even the chicken and the lamb and everything. Ramor says there's some of that opinion. And they say, but when it comes to different kinds of ovens, with some ovens that it would be okay and some ovens it wouldn't be okay. Then he says that's how we go. We really look at the kind of oven, but we say that over the grill, all kinds of food would be problematic. And the Mishna Brura clarifies, we're not talking where the food is actually on the coals. We're actually talking about it being like on a grill over the coals. Okay. Now he says you can't, that's halakha number 1. Halakha number 2, you can't roast onions or eggs or meat on coals unless from Erev Shabbos both sides are going to be a little bit done. So this now speaks to your point, Mark. If you're going to set it up that the one side's going to be fine, but the other side's going to be raw, you can't leave it like that Erev Shabbat. You got to make it that going into Shabbat, it's edible on both sides. But once it's ready, then we're not so worried that you're going to come to stoke it and whatever else, because at the end of the day, you can eat it. It might not be your best, but at the end of the day, you can eat it. You're not going to have a situation where we're worried that you're not going to have food for Shabbos. What if you forgot and you set it up on the grill Erev Shabbos and it did go on the braai on Shabbos? But you held yourself back. You didn't interfere. They said don't do it because you might come to stoke the coals, whatever else. You didn't stoke the coals. You really held yourself back. Everything was fine. But you did the incorrect procedure. Are you allowed to eat that meat on Shabbos?
No.
Correct. Is somebody else allowed to eat that meat on Shabbos?
No.
Correct. Are you allowed to eat it right as soon as the moment that Shabbos comes out?
No.
Excellent, gentlemen. How long do you have to wait? Excellent. That's halakha number 3. Halakha number 4. What about fruits or foods that are usually eaten raw? Are you allowed to put them, around the pot? In this kind of situation where maybe they'll be cooked, maybe they won't be cooked, you are. There you are. Why?
You can still eat them either way.
Because that's it. You're not gonna. There's never gonna be panic stations. So it's cooked. It's half cooked. It's raw. It's edible in all of these situations. Now, the Mishna Brura asks, here he says, you're allowed to put it around the pot, like around the stove. Why doesn't he say you can put it like on the stove of Shabbos? So Mishna Brura says, well, he's telling you the way they used to cook. So that's another thing, you got to be careful when you look at the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes he's telling you a certain way because that's the halakha. Sometimes he's telling you a certain way because that's the recipe. So you got to be sensitive to which way. So he's saying, when it comes to these things, you can put them around the pot. It means you can cook them. You can start cooking those shortly before Shabbat, since at the end of the day, you could eat them completely raw anyway. Nevertheless, you need to be careful not to put the the cover back, because then you actually would be, let's say the cover comes off, right? Or you took the cover off, whatever else, to put the cover back on Shabbat, that's going to be problematic. Even though we don't have the concern that we're worried you're going to intervene in the cooking, you're still not actually allowed to intervene in the cooking. That's the point that he's making. Even things which can be eaten raw, you're not allowed to cook them. Okay? We're just not worried that you may come to cook them. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe? Thank you, Mark. Okay. Is there a point you'd like me to clarify? Okay. Halakha number 5. You can't put bread in the oven close to Shabbos. Bread is similar to meat and eggs and all of these kinds of things. We've got the same problem until it's cooked to the extent that it's edible. What extent would it be that it's edible? That it has a crust, that it develops a crust. Once bread has a crust, then it's edible. Is anybody a baker who can testify to the point at which bread is edible? Yeah, but it raises, but that's from before you even put it in the oven. That's just like the fermentation.
When it's in the oven,
Yeah?
and that's when it goes up there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it doesn't pop.
Yes.
And you know.
But now that's already, when it's completely ready. At what point is it edible?
It's not edible before that. It's like horrible, doughy.
Yes, dough. Look, firstly, I mean, I don't mind doughy challah, right?
And it's
But
edible
it's
straight
edible.
from the dough. You would have been testified.
I don't think it's edible straight from the dough. So the one that he gives is that if it's got the crust. Okay. Yeah, and then he says, now if you're talking about some kinds of pies, right, then it needs to be have the crust at the top and at the bottom, and the filling must also be cooked, right? So there to the pie, obviously it's more complicated because the bread component has to be cooked like bread, and the meat component or the filling component has to be cooked like meat. Now, if you put it in close to Shabbos and it didn't end up crusting before Shabbos, if you did this intentionally, then it's not that it's treif, because treif means you can never ever eat it.
Can't eat it on Shabbat.
You can't eat it on Shabbat, or even right after Shabbat. You've got to wait for the amount of time for it to cook after Shabbat. If you did it by mistake, when it comes to bread, see, when it comes to the extras, we're strict. Whether you did it by mistake or on purpose, you can't eat it. When it comes to bread, if you did it on purpose, you're not allowed to eat it. However, if you did it by mistake, we'll see in just a second.
Sorry to disturb again.
No problem, Rabbi. Great.
I left the taste at the front.
Excellent. And we're back. So you've left this bread in, and you did it by mistake. You put in the bread in the oven before it was Shabbos. So he says, if you don't have any food, so you're allowed to take enough food out of the oven for 3 meals for Shabbat. In other words, you can't just go and take whatever you want, right? You're allowed to take out just for those 3 meals. And if other people also don't have food for Shabbat, you can also tell them to take out for 3 meals. However, there's another issue as well, which is ridiyah, taking the bread out the oven. Now for us, it's a pretty straightforward thing to take the bread out the oven. You put on your oven gloves, you open the oven, you take out the tray, and your bread's out the oven. For them, these were ovens with real fire and all that kind of thing. It's like a pizza oven. You know, you've got your whole thing, right? That's called ridiyah, taking the bread out the oven. Now the rabbi said, even in a case where like this, you made the mistake, whatever, we're going to permit you to take the bread out the oven, you have to do it with a shinui. You have to do it in an unusual way. Because otherwise it's what's called uvdin dechol, doing it in the way that you're doing stuff it's what they call in Yiddish vochedik. Right? It's like a weekday kind of stuff. It's not like Shabbos kind of stuff. So we'll see more examples of that later on through the laws of Shabbat. But this is one example. You don't take it out with your bread shovel. You should rather take it out with a knife or something like that. And if you put it in with enough time that it got crusty, then you're allowed to take it out normally. because you actually didn't do anything wrong. And if you now want to take out bread for tomorrow, you can't do that, even if you want to use your knife or whatever else. This is not the day that you start dealing with your bread for tomorrow. And the Ramo adds in, but this whole discussion about the bread has to get crusty or whatever, that's speaking about an unsealed oven. But if we're talking about the sealed oven, where you were never going to take it out or interfere in the process, then again, that would be absolutely fine, because we don't have a concern that that was permissible to put it in even at the last minute. Now, as the next case, guy put the bread in the oven on Shabbos. Now, on Shabbos.
We're going to Friday night.
Yeah, or Shabbos day, whichever. But Shabbos has already started, and he's put his dough in the oven. Now, here you see that cooking or baking is different to all of the other malachot. Most of the other malachot. Because the other malacha, you do it and it's done. Cooking, you do it and it happens a little bit later. Right, Rabbi Golfan pointed out, cooking is really like a groma. You're really causing something to happen. Writing, I write and it's written. Right? But cooking is like bringing it to fruition. So the same thing over. So when it comes to this, I put it in the oven on Shabbos. I've done something wrong, which, if left unchecked, is going to become a violation of Shabbat. However, it hasn't happened yet. It is theoretically possible to avert disaster. If I would open up the oven and take that bread out again, I'm going to end up with a disaster. Now, we say you're normally not allowed to. Normally you're not allowed to do that. But if I leave it, it's going to, right? So here's the whole discussion. We had it a few Shabbatot ago. We had this in the Shabbos Shir, that there's two different approaches. The one is to say, save somebody from doing something worse by letting them do something not as bad. And the other one is to say, listen, they've made their bed, they must lie in it. You broke Shabbos, then you live with breaking Shabbos. We're not going to permit something that isn't correct, so, to help out sinners. In this case, we do permit it. We say you are allowed to go and take your bread out, so that you don't end up coming to breaking Shabbos according to the Torah. What about, now here we're talking about for the person himself. We're talking about the person himself. But what about somebody else? In other words, you see your friend puts the dough in on Shabbos. And they say, I'm going to do it on Shabbos. And then they say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Can you now go and rescue their bread? You're not allowed to take bread out the oven. But by you taking the bread out the oven, you're going to save them from breaking Shabbos. So here the answer is no. You can't do something wrong in order to save them, but they can do something a little bit wrong to save themselves from doing something a lot wrong. Now the Shulchan Aruch continues that when it comes to our ovens, where you don't need to use like this bread shovel, you're allowed to take out even more than 3 meals with a knife or something like that, because it isn't that same process of getting it out. But you shouldn't use like an equivalent, kind of bread shovel thing, because then again it looks like what you're doing during the week. Okay, then he goes into cooking some kind of lentil soup or some kind of lentil dish, which normally cooks very, very quickly. So he says, so there you can't put that in. You can't put it in the oven erev Shabbos close to Shabbos because it cooks quickly. So that's going to be problematic. And again, if you did that even by mistake, you're not allowed to eat that over Shabbat. Similarly, you can't fill a flask of water and put it in the oven erev Shabbos so that it's going to heat up and become hot on Shabbos. You can't do that. You've got to give it enough time. What's the relevant application of that for us today? Your urn. You can't turn your urn on 2 minutes before Shabbos. You have to turn your urn on with enough time that water is going to get hot by the time that Shabbos comes in. How long does that take? Yeah, rough estimate? 8 minutes.
10 minutes?
8 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. So, in a situation where it's like really, this is the time when everyone's at panic stations. Sometimes you have such Shabbatot. It's panic stations. It's about to come Shabbos. You're scrambling to say, okay, what do we need to do? Turn on the hot tray, light the candles, turn on the urn. No, can't turn on the urn. You missed your opportunity. You didn't do that when there was time. Can't do that now.
Hey, you got 18 minutes, come. Give us a break.
So let's say you're using that. You're in that 18 minutes. Yeah, it's
Really?
Panic stations.
Panic stations.
For Shabbos, eh?
No coffee for
That's
Shabbos.
not sure.
Come to shul, have it at the shul early.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, however, I wonder if it might not be different with our urns. Why would it be different with our urns?
Because it goes the process over and over and over. It starts and
Yeah, but it's to get it going. It's to get it boiling hot. Keeping it boiling hot.
Yeah. See, I was going to say because